For those joining asynchronously in the future, thank you for joining. I hope this provides value in some way. So I am completing this presentation for PIDP 3400. My focus is on creative ways to form groups in the subject area of cooperative learning. I'd like to acknowledge, before getting any further into this, that I'm joining from the unceded and traditional territory of the Wet'suwet'en, where the Smithers campus of the Coast Mountain College is located. That's where I work, that's where I'm employed and live and play, and I'm honored to go to school as well at Vancouver Community College online, but I just want to acknowledge that they're located on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people who have been stewards of their land from time immemorial. With that acknowledgement, I want to introduce myself. All right. My name is David Giernazzo. I work at the Coast Mountain College, where I've been an instructor of business for a few years in the Smithers campus, which is pictured in the background there. I didn't take this picture, but this is the facility I work at, and I'm very blessed to be able to work there and work in the field of teaching. This work is licensed under Creative Commons, share alike. Others may copy, distribute, display, perform, modify my work, as long as they distribute any modified work within this license terms. I think that's a fair way to approach it. My motivation for choosing this topic is purely because I wanted to spend some time diving into creative approaches to group setting, and because it's something that I've already started exploring on my own time. I think it's really important to have a lot of tools in the toolbox, which I will circle back to later. There's three areas that I want to focus on in my presentation. First, I want to draw a brief picture of cooperative learning and why it's important that we have this conversation about creative approaches to group formation. In the second section, and hopefully the more important, I want to look at some options in hopefully a logical way that kind of puts them in context. And then finally in section 3, open it up to any questions, comments, and hopefully, if there are anything that I can anticipate and answer, I will do so. On that note, I've got closed captions on here on the PowerPoint, so hopefully if you are watching this and you're not able to listen, that will perform well. It's not something I've tested very much. I've used it once before, so hopefully that works out for you. Cooperative learning. So not within the scope of this presentation to dive into the theory behind cooperative learning. I'll look at a few things, but basically I just want to give you a brief overview for the purpose of you being able to understand the examples and how they fit in and why they're important. Most of us use group work in our classes in some way. The reasons in terms of our course design of why we use these approaches can vary. Generally, though, we have some course outcome that has a component of social emotional learning that is intended to prepare our students for the future in some way. In my case, I teach in the business program. Generally, I try to incorporate group learning in each class in some way because having the skill set to work with colleagues and peers in the future is important. But I'm also interested in using it because the research shows that it creates more effective learning experiences. Group work is the term I use most often for my colleagues. I think the correct term for that, there's a few different terms, but in this context, cooperative learning. And I've got a definition here. Cooperation is working together to accomplish a shared goal. Within cooperative situations, individuals seek outcomes that are beneficial to themselves and beneficial to all other group members. And this is from Johnson & Johnson 2014. And they go on to define cooperative learning as the instructional use of small groups so that students work together to maximize their own and each other's learning. One of the key things that separates cooperative learning from other types of group-based learning is that it's how we evaluate that changes depending on the type of group-based learning. And so without getting into too much, when we're talking about cooperative learning, we're talking about a mix of evaluation done because of criteria, which is like any individual assignment, and a mix of that with norm-based references. That is, we're evaluating against how the peers operate as well as against criteria. So with all that in mind, a few terms that we need to understand. Informal cooperative learning groups. Brahman BL is the resource I'm using to refer to in this. In informal cooperative learning groups, small, temporary, ad hoc groups of 2 or 4 students work together for brief periods in a class, typically up to 1 class period. Potentially longer depending on, and I'll touch on one example, to answer questions or respond to prompts posed by the instructor or to accomplish some sort of learning task. In conjunction with that, we've got formal cooperative learning groups. This is where a longer term assignment is assigned. Students work together for 1 or more class periods. They complete a joint task or an assignment. There are several features that can help these groups work well. According to Braham and Brielle, and then Johnson et al. 2014, the instructor defines the learning objective for the activity and assigns students to groups based on that in some way. The groups are ideally heterogeneous. Ideally, there's a mix of skills, a mix of approaches. Within these groups, students may be assigned specific roles, maybe by the instructor, maybe as an activity that the group does. Ideally, the instructor continues to play an active role during the group work, monitoring, evaluating both group and individual performance. Generally, the way these are separated is informal is short-term, formal is long-term. And this is all within that cooperative learning sphere. In addition to the informal formal, I have noticed something called learning teams, which I don't think fits perfectly into either category. I haven't seen anything that kind of defines where this might fit. But if informal is the short term, involves things like jigsaw discussion activities, think, pair, share, peer instruction, breakout groups, things like that. And formal is things like the group presentation, group exam, group report, group project, etc. Then learning teams are kind of in the middle somewhere where you form a group at the start of a semester. It has a long-term perspective, but they're reformed in each class to work on a specific thing. So there might be longevity in terms of who's in the group in some way, but they're going to work in short-term chunks. And so I've thrown it in there as well, kind of in between the two, because I'm not sure exactly where that might fit in to those two categories. So that's the scenario, that's the background. And the question we're left with is, why should an instructor get involved in forming these groups? Why can't an instructor just say, okay, get into groups? And maybe that is the technique that works best. But we want to know a little bit more about why. So just briefly looking at the research. I've got a few sources up here. They're all pointing to one learning. Heterogeneous is groups that are not uniform. They're not uniform in cognitive ability. They're not uniform in cultural background, in age, in any other way that you can divide people up into different groups. The more homogeneous a group is, the less well they will do performing. And the research that this is pulled from, 3 sources are listed up there. First, looking at Lam et al. 2012. In a research article titled The Influence of Cognitive Diversity on Group Problem Solving. I've used this resource in past courses. It looks at the role of cognitive diversity on group problem solving strategy. It did so through some tasks that were assigned within a class. It didn't look at enough people for it to have statistical validity, but what it found when it assigned group work for 2 homogeneous groups, 1 low performing, 1 high performing, and 1 heterogeneous group, is that the heterogeneous group outperformed at a very high level, and it used a full spectrum of decision-making tools rather than just jumping to a decision quite easily. So there's that research. Feitner and Davis in 1984, looking at why some groups failed. This is interesting because it was student reported. It was surveys done of students who had been in group works. And it found that most students are likely to have more positive experiences in classes where groups are either formed by the instructor or by a combination of methods that results in some sort of heterogeneous group structure. In recording information about a group's worst group experience, 40% of the respondents noted that groups were formed by the students themselves in their worst case. And what he found was this is because when you form a group with your peers, the social relationship. So students will protect the social relationship and sacrifice performance. Cooper 2021, great resource. I use it extensively in this presentation. Definitely recommend reading it. In this article, Cooper identifies that self-selected groups, pulling from Bapler 2016, can result in an inequitable distribution of student resources and abilities. So there is a justice element here. All this points to the same thing. Heterogeneous groups are good. Heterogeneous groups must be formed by instructors. That's just the nature of how they are. I put together a little matrix here. My intention is to show what I'm thinking when I look at different ways to form groups. In informal groups, ideally, for low complexity and low performance group formation techniques, they'll fit really well here. This is where you just want something quick. You don't want to spend a lot of time on it. It's something that you're trying to do in class. There's creative ways to do this that should be explored, but generally you're going to want to look at things like randomly generating groups or some way to split people up in new ways each class. It's not needed to necessarily dive into how to allocate people in a heterogeneous way as much. On the other side, we've got the formal groups. These are the long-term groups. This might include the learning teams. And this is where you want high complexity. You can spend more time on it, and it is allocated. You want groups that'll perform. The longer the group is going to be together, the more likely it is that the instructor should consider an instructor-led group formation activity. Trying to balance the resources, mainly time costs, with performance goals. So let's talk about some actual techniques. Let's get creative. I want to look at a few different techniques. I wrote 3 techniques here. That's where it started, but it expanded, and I should have edited this to take acknowledgement of the expansion beyond 3 techniques. And what I've actually done is looked at 5 different categories. I've looked at randomly generated, self-selected, instructor-generated, mixed approaches, and resources that you can refer to later for more. What I'm not doing here is creating an exhaustive list of everything. There are so many different ways out there to do this. I just look for things that I found interesting. The first one is, and before I get into them, I'm taking from Cooper 2021. You'll see that in the references, cooperative learning strategies from eMints, one of my favorite resources, so check that one out. And that's where I'm pulling from for most of these. So first up, randomly generated. This is where there is less rhyme and reason or criteria used in the creation of the groups. We just want some way to get students into groups quickly. If you are saying everyone get into groups of 6, that is, that's not really the randomly generated. That's going to be more into the self-selected. It's kind of our traditional approach. But with randomly generating, we're looking for some mechanism to get people into groups on their own. So we've got lineup. Lineup is any way that you get criteria not related to performance. Have students line up according to some pattern, alphabetical order, student number, maybe by some other aspect that would be fun or interesting as part of some icebreaker, height, age, etc., depending on what you're doing. And then you group in order down the line. You can either number them off and have them sort into their numbers, which we'll talk about in count off, or you can just say, first 5 you're in a group, second 5 you're in a group. There's no real method or reason here in the lineup except that you don't want peer groups together, so this is a way to kind of arbitrarily split students up. Computer assisted, I use this for randomly generated because in learning management software, there's usually some function that lets you randomly break people into groups. So I use Brightspace at work. If I go in there and I click random group, and it will randomly assign students. This can be useful if you want something that the students can refer to. I find it useful in that way because a lot of my students are English second language. So if they can look at which group they're part of and I can tell them which group they're a part of, then I'm kind of scaffolding in support for them to get into the groups easily. Count off is when you decide on a number of groups and then have the class count off to that number in sequence. You can do that, they can do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the 1s get together, all the 2s get together, all the 3s get together, all the 4s get together, etc. It's not purely random, but what you're tending to do is you're tending to find people that are sitting together, which would be usually their friends and peers, and then you're breaking them up. So I find this is actually better than random because breaking up peers is one way to get towards heterogeneity, especially from background. One resource in Cooper 2021, he's referencing Gabrielle 2018. He said that she assigns 3 categories of groupings at the start of the semester, say or a number, a color, and some other category. And then each student has those 3 things. Throughout the semester, she may say, get into your color groups, get into your number groups, get into your time groups. And so there's a variety of groups formed in the short term, but students stay in consistent groups throughout. I'm definitely going to be using that one in the future. I like the way that sounds like it would work. One way to kind of shift away from random generation is to use some sort of criteria-based sorting. You use an initial criteria and then you group based on that criteria. So we're kind of moving away from random towards other types of sorting. You can introduce a topic, let's say, then ask students to organize into 3 groups, one that has a limited knowledge of the topic, one that has a moderate, comfortable understanding, and one that has experience or knowledge. The groups in those 2 categories or in those 3 categories will be randomly assigned then to a group that has a mix of categories. So if I'm teaching a class with a mix of industry professionals, lots of people that are new to the industry, this might be a great way to kind of mix them up. And generally they'll understand, especially if it's a short-term informal group. Lots of fun ways to do these. You can use candy. Have 4 types of candy. Students come in, they pick one of the types of candy, they take the candy, they go to their desk and eat it. Once everyone's in, you group them by candy, and now you've got 4 groups. Birthday month is a way to sort if you're using the lineup. You can have a playing card deck, and you can hand out playing cards and then sort based on suit, number, or color. You can pair with pre-made cards. You're doing like an icebreaker where you've got pairings like peanut butter and jam in the group, and then peanut butter has to find jam. You can use index cards or slips of paper. Puzzles work. If you've got 4 or 5 different kids' puzzles, maybe 6 or 7, then they can find each other, put the puzzle together, and they're in a group. Lots of different resources out there. Definitely check the resources slide. Self-selected. This is where they get into groups on their own. The downside of self-selected is it has the lowest type of performance, and usually they form with peers. So if you have a completely self-selected group, everyone get into groups of 5, not much work for you as an instructor. That's a bonus. Sometimes it takes even longer for them to get into groups this way because someone has to start to lead the formation, and you still have to facilitate, blanking for me to tell them what to do, and that's pretty expected. So while it's easy conceptually, it doesn't take much effort to come up with a plan, everyone get into groups of 5, sometimes it's not as effective as even we'd want it to be for its purpose. One way you can do self-selected is to use the computer, your learning management software. It probably has an option for self-selecting, Brightspace does. In that I can say create 6 groups with 5 students in each group, and then I allow my students to sign up. And when I get to mixed, I'll talk about another feature in some way, maybe around topics or some other thing. They can use their learning management software to do it. Great if you're not teaching in person. Conversations is a prompt-based approach. It's a specific term used for a specific type of prompt-based approach. A prompt-based approach being you give prompts, students self-select around those prompts. You can put limits on the number of students. You can put the prompts up in the classroom, around the classroom. You can do it asynchronously around breakout rooms. One way to do this is the conversation. You place discussion prompts or questions at various locations around the room, assign small teams of students to each prompt. In small teams, the students will discuss the prompt, and once the question has been discussed, have each team select 2 members to move on to other conversations. It's a way to have those groups reform around the conversation that they appreciate. And I'll look into a specific way I do this that I've developed over a while. The discussion shuffle is another form of think, pair, share. It's a more relaxed version. When directed, students can randomly move around the room. They can stop and discuss a given topic with any available partner or group. When the discussion is complete, students begin to move once more. And since the pairing and grouping is informal, you can remind students of appropriate ways of interacting. A discussion shuffle has occurred. Everyone's kind of talked about what kind of groups they want, and you can have them move into groups based on that discussion, just like the prompt-based. Table groups is one way to do it. You set up tables. Students come in, you tell them to get into a table group with other peers and leave it up to them who sits where, but now they're organized into groups and you can move on with the activity. Instructor generated. The simplest way to form groups conceptually, even if it takes a bit of time, is to just say everyone get into groups. But if you wanted to get them a little more heterogeneous, you can sit down with your class list and you can go through and you can review it and consider things like, are there established peer groups that you can break up? Are there established cultural groups? Are there natural leaders and followers, cognitive ability? And you can assign groups to, or individuals to groups based on those variables. This requires a knowledge of your students. And sometimes when you're making the groups, you're doing it at the start of class, start of the semester, you don't have that knowledge yet. So one tool you can use is a questionnaire or other forms of research to kind of build up knowledge about your groups. One source that I was looking at, this is in Cooper 2021 as well, he was referencing another researcher, Foote 2020, and he said that she used things like Harry Potter houses, things that are a little more fun and exciting to sort students into learning teams. One of the issues I see with that and with other personality tests is that if you've got all of the same kind of personality in a group, you're back to that homogeneous group. To get heterogeneous groups, you want to split up the different types of groups that you have formed that way. I've done this a lot. One class I teach business ethics. It's in the second semester of the cohort year. So I know the students at this point, groups myself. I also think it's a good fit for that class because I provide a lot of in-class time to work on the group project. One of the downsides expressed by students with being in groups that they don't get a say in is they need to schedule around different work schedules and different school schedules. So it can be very challenging for them. So this works best if you've got a lot of in-class time to work on those groups or on those group projects. Again, you can use the learning management software to help here. There might be quiz functionality to gather information. You might be able to look at things like engagement online, time spent in discussion posts, how many discussion posts read. That could be used to kind of definitely create your groups. Mixed groups, my favorite category, one of the hardest to kind of define. I'm probably going to spend the remaining of my time in this group looking at one specific, but a few techniques you can use. Corners is where you set up topic areas in each corner of the room. Ask students to go to topic areas they like that best represents their thinking. Maybe it's an opinion or something. And then individuals in that corner form groups around that topic area. Great for when you've got topic lists already and you want groups to form around topics. Lots of variations on this. Conversations we've already talked about. That would be a variation on this that you could use with a little more discussion. And I'll look at another variation in the next slide. Activity-based self-selection. This is where you figure out an activity that you're going to use. One that I've used is a compass point personality test. This is where it kind of is a very simple, can be done in 20 minutes personality test, not rigorous by any means, but it kind of breaks people into 4 groups based on, are they leaders, details oriented, big picture oriented, do they get tasks done right away or do they think about it, that kind of stuff, a lot of the Myers-Briggs types personality dichotomies. And once they're in the groups based around their personality, I tell them to form groups with people from different personality groups. If it is, they've paired up with people they know they can schedule with, but we have a mix of cognitive abilities in the group. So you have an activity, and then from that activity, they self-select based on how that activity breaks them up. One method is different partners. This is where students self-select a pair or maybe 2 people that they're going to work with, and then every class after that, they're allowed to self-select again, but they have to find different partners. So if you're getting them into groups consistently, maybe for lab partners, maybe for some other activity, something that uses pairs a lot and will happen every class, an approach like this can keep it fresh and keep it fair. Finally, computer assisted. I use Brightspace to allow a self-selection period of, say, a day, maybe in class. And then at the end of that, it has an option to randomly assign everyone that hasn't self-selected, or for me to go in and allocate people after that self-allocation period. That helps. I want to look at one example that I have found huge success with. I call this the sticky note wall or the sticky topic wall. It's a mix of a few different activities that I found out there with names. I haven't found this exact activity because it's a combination, but in brief, you introduce your purpose. And this is really important. You want your students, because there's an element of self-allocation here, you want your students to know where you're trying to go and why. So in my case, I introduce the assignment. I tell them why we're doing groups. I use this in one specific class where the outcome is not just the assignment itself, but also the reflection on the group work and how groups work together. So this is a really good way to do that so that the group forms around that purpose. Then you get into the first activity, which is a sticky note brainstorm. If you're not familiar, a sticky note brainstorm, each student has sticky notes. They put topic ideas on them alone. They then present those topics by reading them out loud, talking about them, briefly, and each time they present one, the instructor takes it and puts it on the whiteboard. The idea is that as the sticky notes are added to the whiteboard, the instructor can move them and group them into thematic areas. But the ideas are all generated by the students. My purpose when I do this is that the students are generating ideas and topics in a topic area that they are passionate about or interested in. That's what I'm looking for, is a little bit of that passion. Once the whiteboard is filled with the themes, the instructor is trying to get those themes down to a number or up to a number that matches the number of groups needed. Once we've got a board filled with themes, we've got maybe 6 different themes on the board, you can start to do something called a pinwheel or a conversation where you take those themes and you get students to put them on flip charts around the room, say in 6 stations. 6 themes, 6 stations. And from here, we have a kind of free-flowing discussion that lasts for a period of time. Often called a pinwheel. I modify this to be a little more free-flowing. Students can move freely. Whoever's first topic is the note-taker recorder, notes down what's there. And when that note-taker leaves, because they can move freely, someone else has to take on that role. The idea is that students visit each topic and theme area, stay as long as they find it interesting, and add to the discussion. And over that 45 minutes, we have 6 different stations with 6 different topics that have all been kind of discussed by every student in the room in some way, and students have a really solid understanding of what they're interested in. And then from there, we form groups. This is the most important part and can be a little bit tricky because it needs kind of that back and forth between the students and the instructor, and there's no real concrete rule set here. But you basically form groups around topic areas that students are interested in. And what should happen is that you have groups of students based on what they're interested in rather than on who they know. You're going to juggle a little bit. You're going to get these groups into a specific number that matches your topic area or matches your assignment, so 6 students to a group. And that might require a couple groups per theme. But from there, they now have a topic, they have a group, and usually what I then do is assign them their first group assignment, which is a team agreement of some sort where they list out their schedule, they come up and then go into your learning management software system where they can self-enroll in one of your pre-made group areas and take care of the admin part themselves. Okay, so that's my list of creative resources, hopefully useful. I've pulled these from a few areas. I'm going to point to the second resource in this list. This is my #1 resource. Definitely check it out. It's a link there. You may be able to click it when watching this. You may not, but I also have that listed in the references at the end. Highly recommend. Basically just a huge database of different learning strategies. I like to throw in a slide like this where I can just stop, pause, breathe, reflect. It's unscripted, unstructured. Sometimes when I'm presenting, I make connections that are interesting that I haven't thought about before. And I think in this presentation, the #1 is that you need to consider these as tools in a toolbox. Use some of the less optimal group forming strategies if you need to do something quick. Use the longer ones when you want to have more performance. And think about the process as its own learning outcome. And that can be a key in kind of making the case to allocate time for something like the sticky note wall where it takes a lot of time. It's easy for me to think I can use that time for this because I know that the process itself will be valuable. And that's my presentation. I'm not joined by anyone, so that'll make questions and answers a little bit tricky. I think if I was anticipating questions that might come, I think the easiest one to anticipate is where can I look for more information? And it doesn't take much work to find more information about group forming techniques. Generally, I find a good starting place is with your center of learning if your college has one, or you can go to the websites for other universities and colleges' centers of learning, and they have almost guaranteed some page that goes over cooperative learning and has strategies for it. I have done that many times. I've got a few sources like the first one here in the list, Brahim and Brielle, that are from Vanderbilt University Center for Teaching. A perfect example of what I'm talking about. I do want to draw your attention to Cooper 2021. And the second resource there, Cooperative Learning Strategies, eMints. This is a Google site. This is an excellent strategy. This is the one I was talking about, an A+ resource. So definitely take a look at that resource. I highly recommend it. And on that note, that is it for me. These are my references. I hope that you found this presentation valuable, and looking forward to seeing any posts that might occur below it. Thank you very much for your attention.